America was founded as a constitutional republic, not a democracy.
You know, we don't live in a democracy, because a democracy is two wolves and a lamb deciding what's for dinner, okay? It's not just majority rule, it's a constitutional republic.
No, nut jobs. We're not a democracy, we're a constitutional republic.
The Constitution prohibits America from ever becoming a democracy. We have to remain a republic.
Since the 2020 election, a new dog whistle has emerged as part of the far-right's rallying cry around their perceived oppression and how they can justify their claims of stolen elections and woke extremism. And it's something I hadn't heard of until I started getting comment after comment on my YouTube videos, TikToks, Twitter, and more from people wholly ignoring the point I was making to inform me that actually my entire point was moot because I was referring to the United States as a democracy, when clearly it is not a democracy, it is a republic. This was perplexing to me because I had never heard anyone be a stickler about that before, as many people use democracy and republic interchangeably, and why wouldn't we identify the US as a democracy? Isn't that our whole thing? Spreading democracy to dark, savage communists of the world? Why is this seemingly minute semantic disparity all of a sudden a Republican rallying cry? Turns out, like with most things, it's a hell of a lot more complicated than yes, the US is, or no, the US isn't a democracy or a republic. The way you or I answer that question hinges less on facts and technicalities and more on our individual worldviews, and has more to do with what we believe to be inherent in human nature, what we think the function of government should be, and whether or not we believe in the value of equality. Turns out the US is both, but also mostly, it's neither. Roll the intro. Thank you to my partner on today's video, PDS Debt. We all know that everything is costing more these days, especially with the holidays upon us, from bananas to shampoo to electronics and more, and many people are at the point where they're buying the same things they always do, but have to put some of it on credit cards just to get by, and that can add up, and suddenly you have more debt than you know what to do with. And credit card debt sucks. I've had it, I get it. People assume YouTubers are all millionaires, but believe it or not, some of us are just paying our bills and our debts like the rest of you. We just happen to make these little internet videos to do it. And those debts can really weigh on you and feel like you will never get out from under them. I get it. PDS Debt can help. PDS Debt has customized 0% interest options for anyone struggling with credit cards, personal loans, collections, or medical bills. PDS Debt is offering a free debt analysis. It only takes 30 seconds. Head over to pdsdebt.com/Miller to get your free debt assessment today. You'll receive a full breakdown on how to save on interest each month and the quickest way to take care of your debt. Everyone with over $10,000 in debt qualifies, and there's no minimum credit score required. PDS Debt rolls all of your payments into one low 0% interest monthly payment, so you can save thousands in interest and fees. If you're making payments every month on your debt but your balances just won't seem to go down, this program's for you. So to take advantage of PDS Debt's free debt analysis just for my viewers, go to pdsdebt.com/Miller to complete the quick and easy debt assessment in just 30 seconds. That's pdsdebt.com/Miller. Thanks, PDS Debt. A growing chorus of voices within the Republican Party, from grassroots activists to high-profile politicians, asserts that the US is a republic, not a democracy. The origin of this current trend can be traced back to the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election. Amidst widespread claims of election fraud, claims that were dismissed by election officials from both parties and judges appointed by presidents across the political spectrum, election denialism transformed from a fringe theory into a significant movement. Critics saw this as an attack on democracy, but some election deniers countered by emphasizing that the US isn't a democracy, it's fundamentally a republic. For example, in a recent New York Times article, Selena Bliss, a GOP candidate for the Arizona state legislature, stated, "We are not a democracy. Nowhere in the Constitution does it use the word democracy. I think of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's not us." Which is funny, because the word republic is also in the title, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but okay. The debate then often becomes even more convoluted as both political camps, Republicans and Democrats, accuse each other of disrespecting either democracy or the Constitution interchangeably, and in this tug-of-war, the terms democracy and republic become increasingly weaponized, particularly in the realm of social media and cable TV news. A notable moment in this trend happened in October 2020 when Senator Mike Lee of Utah declared on Twitter, "We are not a democracy." He elaborated that the US system is best described as a constitutional republic, where power is not vested in mere majorities, but in a carefully balanced structure. This redefinition of the US political system has been accompanied by growing hostility towards the concept of democracy itself. Throughout Arizona's 2022 political season, these anti-democratic sentiments were openly expressed by Republicans in meetings, speeches, and rallies. And this shift represents a stark departure from previous Republican stances, such as those of President George W. Bush, who actively promoted democracy worldwide. Figures like Loren Culp, the Republican candidate for governor of Washington, have labeled democracy as a precursor to socialism and communism. These views stand in stark contrast again to the democracy promotion of the Bush era and mark a significant transformation in the Republican approach to governance and electoral politics. Though I would wager a bet that half the people in my comment section screaming about a republic don't fully understand what they're talking about, instead just parroting what they've heard Republican leaders say, thinking that the word republic sounds a lot like the word Republican, and so it's probably good, right? So for them, and for all of us, let's go into some definitions, shall we? Democracy. A democracy is a form of government in which all eligible citizens have the right to participate equally, either directly or through elected representatives, in the creation of laws. In a pure democracy, every eligible individual gets a direct vote on every decision made in the running of the country, and that majority is not restrained by any checks or balances and can impose its will on the minority. The concept of pure democracy was first practiced in ancient Athens around 507 BCE. There was no structure of checks and balances like a legislature or Supreme Court that could curtail the will of the majority. It was purely that whatever the majority wanted goes. In contrast, in a representative democracy, the people vote to elect one person to represent them in the daily votes and running of the government. But let's talk about the modern definition of democracy. Today, when politicians and laypeople say the word democracy, no one understands them to be referring to a pure democracy unchecked by a constitution or protections for minorities. Not only is it unrealistic to hold a national vote on every decision to run the country, it's also not how any country operates anywhere in the world. From just a basic linguistic standpoint, it would make absolutely no sense for someone to say democracy in a sentence and another person to understand that to mean a pure democracy like the one in Athens in 507 BCE. Unless, of course, that other person is doing so disingenuously to make a larger point about their values and worldview, but we'll get into that. Today, the word democracy is also frequently used in reference to democratic principles like equality and freely held elections, in comparison to other countries around the world who do not adhere to democratic principles. Republic. The term republic comes from Latin res publica, meaning public thing, but commonly translated to commonwealth or state. The earliest republic was in ancient Rome around the same time as the Athenian democracy. The concept of one person, one vote was not practiced in Rome. Instead, they adopted the idea of voting units. The majority of votes within one unit counted as the outcome of that entire unit, and then the majority of units constituted the final outcome of the voting. That's exactly where our electoral college comes from. While the people are still the source of a republic's power, their will is filtered through representatives, and there's a constitution or charter of rights that protects minority interests. However, in Rome, those in higher socioeconomic classes were given more voting units, so the richer you were, the more your voice counted. This was based on the Republican belief that the unwashed masses probably didn't know how to properly run a government, and a ruling class made more sense than allowing everyone to speak for themselves. This was also something our founding fathers believed pretty fervently in. They were incredibly wary of mob rule, and they fully excluded everyone except landed white men in their constitution. This was a feature, not an oversight. Federalism. In the United States, power is shared between national and state governments. The feds have control over certain aspects of running the country, and the rest is left to the states to govern. This is known as federalism, shared governing between a strong central government and decentralized states. Democratic republics. Most modern nations, including the United States, are democratic republics. They combine the principles of democracy, like electing representatives through a direct election where every individual vote counts, with the structure of a republic, having a constitution or charter and other checks on pure majority rule. If you want to get very specific, the US is a federal constitutional representative democracy, or a federal democratic republic, as it embodies both democratic, election of representatives, and republican, constitutional rule, elements. Here are some examples of the elements of democracy in the United States. At the state level, referenda are held wherein each individual vote is counted and the outcome is determined based on what gets the majority of votes. That's about the closest we get to pure democracy. Representatives in state legislatures and in Congress are required to generally each represent the same number of people. Each representative in the House of Representatives in the US represents around 700,000 people. Those 700,000 people vote to directly elect who they want to represent them in government. This is representative democracy at work. Here are examples of elements of republicanism in the US. I mean small r republicanism. The US president is indirectly elected via the Electoral College, which was an intentional system built to ensure that the will of smaller states isn't overtaken by larger, more urban states. Similarly, every state is given 2 senators regardless of size or population. These are aspects of a republic meant to check that the will of the majority doesn't drown out the rights of minorities. Similarly, a constitution with a Bill of Rights and a Supreme Court to enforce that constitution are republican elements of our government. This system, coupled with the direct election of members of Congress and other officials, illustrates a complex mix of direct and indirect democracy and republicanism within a federal constitutional framework. It's a republic, and it's a democracy. It's both. But I'll explain why I think it's mostly neither in a minute. The word democracy doesn't appear in the Constitution. The word republic appears only once. In writing our Constitution, the framers knew about these definitions and the ancient philosophies that formed them. Creating a balance between democracy, republicanism, and federalism was entirely new, so they were just kind of making it up as they went. And extensive historical documentation makes it clear that they never reached a full consensus about what exactly it all meant. Alexander Hamilton, a key figure in the founding of the United States, made conflicting statements that can be pointed to back up either argument. He's quoted as saying, "We are now forming a republican government. Real liberty is neither found in despotism or the extremes of democracy, but in moderate governments." He also wrote in the Federalist Papers that a representative democracy, where the right of election is well secured and regulated, and the exercise of the legislative, executive, and judiciary authorities is vested in select person, chosen really and not nominally by the people, will, in my opinion, be most likely to be happy, regular, and durable. That being said, the framers of the Constitution were generally skeptical of direct democracy or pure democracy, fearing the impulsiveness and self-interest of the masses. This skepticism was shared by John Adams, who voiced strong opposition to ordinary people making significant political decisions, believing that more educated and qualified individuals should guide governance, not the unwashed masses. However, Thomas Jefferson, a proponent of Athenian-style democracy, envisioned a government where local matters would still be decided by popular vote, advocating for a balance of national, state, and local governance. By the time Abraham Lincoln was interpreting the founders' intent 80 years later, he used constitutional republic and democracy interchangeably, and is quoted as saying, "A majority, held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations, and always changing easily, with deliberate changes of popular opinions and sentiments, is the only true sovereign of a free people." It wasn't until the 20th century that this argument over whether the US is a democracy or a republic started as a means of pushing against changing times. It's an easy soundbite that overlooks centuries of nuance. It gained most prominence in the mid-1960s and was chanted at the 1964 Republican Convention, a backlash to the civil rights movement that culminated in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965, which ensured that voting rights could not legally be restricted, finally extending full democratic voting rights to everyone, not just white men with land. It's no coincidence that this is when the argument that the Founding Fathers never meant us to be a democracy at all picked up steam among white conservatives, and it makes perfect sense that it would once again become a talking point in the 21st century. And while Senator Mike Lee's tweet in 2020 seems to have been the impetus that brought the discussion to national attention today, his tweet came a couple months after one influential think tank released an extended report titled "America is a Republic, Not a Democracy." That think tank was none other than our friend, the Heritage Foundation, creator of Project 2025. We've talked about them quite a bit. This is another example of how this shady little organization is spoon-feeding every Republican talking point, making national news. Though I will note that Mike Lee, after his infamous tweet, released a longer statement about what he means when he says America is not a democracy. And he says, insofar as democracy means a political system in which government derives its powers from the consent of the governed, then of course that accurately describes our system. Okay, so you agree. You agree that using the term democracy to describe our government isn't technically wrong. Great. Glad we cleared that up. What he takes issue with, however, is that the term democracy has been co-opted to mean that it is required of the government to reflexively carry out the will of the majority without thought of the rights of minorities. And by minorities, he certainly doesn't mean the blacks and the gays, I can tell you that right now. This would be a non-argument if it was just the brown people who were being trampled by the will of the majority. But that's Mike Lee. Let's take a look at the Heritage Foundation report that he got all of his regurgitated talking points from. I read the entirety of this 24-page report, so you don't have to. As with many Heritage reports, it's written by a PhD, PhD, some guy named 𝗪𝗠𝗪𝗪𝗧𝗛, a professor at Assumption University, which is a Roman Catholic liberal arts school in Worcester, Massachusetts. This is part of the Heritage Foundation goal to legitimize batshit crazy ideas by paying a PhD to say it. And he certainly made it sound smart, I'll give him that. Right at the beginning of the report, he goes ahead and just says the quiet parts out loud, so that's helpful, I guess. He says, "The careful balance produced by our mixed republic is threatened by an egalitarianism that undermines the social, familial, religious, and economic distinctions and inequalities that undergird our political liberty. Preserving the Republican freedoms we cherish requires tempering egalitarian zeal and moderating the hope for a perfectly just democracy." Okay, did you catch that? He's saying egalitarianism, that is equality, threatens the social and economic inequalities that are the foundation of our country and essential to our freedom and liberty. He goes on to say, contrary to popular belief, America is not, nor was it meant to be, a pure democracy. America is a republic. Nevertheless, more and more voices today are calling for America to become a direct democracy. Notice that even the Heritage Foundation was clear to say pure democracy and direct democracy here. But that talking point has been passed down a game of idiot telephone, so now if you say the word democracy, conservatives will just parrot, "It's not a democracy, it's a republic," without actually firing a single synapse in their brains. The report goes on to explain the virtues of small r republicanism. Republicanism recognizes the valid contributions to the welfare of the community by non- and even counter-majoritarian parts of the community. Indeed, justice demands that, even in a nation rooted in popular consent, non- and counter-majoritarian forces must be blended together. In this way, republicanism protects the minority from unjust majorities and secures the conditions for the political and social freedoms that are the true goal of the American Revolution. To be clear, he means the right minorities, like white Christian Republican men whose numbers are dwindling and they know it, and not the wrong minority, blacks, gays, theys, etc., whose rights have almost never been protected by small or big r republicanism. The report says the limitless passion for equality, the root cause for seeking direct democracy, undermines respect for all of those social, familial, civic, and religious institutions that separate individuals from one another, establish hierarchies, dictate codes of behavior, and most importantly, help us preserve our liberties. Its underlying cause is an insatiable love of democracy that seeks to apply its egalitarian principle to the family, education, social and religious life, and finally to the norms, practices, and institutions that define who we are as a republic. And this is where we can start to uncover how this discussion of whether America is a republic or a democracy is less about semantics or even the founding fathers and more about values and worldview. Here he's saying that egalitarianism necessarily would put equality over hierarchies. It would necessarily constrain some freedom and liberty. Because basically, those who historically have power, white male Christians, would have to give up some of their power in order for others to become equal too. And if you believe that those hierarchies, traditional family structures and Christian hierarchies and traditional values, are the basis of our humanity, and you've benefited historically from those structures, then yeah, equality and democracy are a threat. Later in the report, he makes his point even clearer. Because the limits of human nature make it impossible to raise everyone up to the highest level, most human beings cannot become a Socrates, a Newton, a Mozart, the desire for equality can only be satisfied by bringing everyone down. Like, we've gone from pure democracy is bad to if we allow for equality, it'll bring everyone down. That's insane. No one's asking for that. It's also ironic because today there's probably 1,000 Mozarts being born into families that can't afford a piano, so we'll never know. But if we had more equality of resources and access, those kids could actually pursue their passion for classical music or whatever. This argument makes it very clear who he's looking at when he says equality will bring us all down. The top. The people who are benefiting from the inequality. Fuck the rest. He then laments about Athenian direct democracy, saying that they didn't give the oligarchs enough power. Yeah, he's like, the oligarchs in ancient Athens really were mistreated and the majority trampled all over them. He said, had the Athenian assembly employed representation with the protection of diverse views that it entails, the wisdom of the oligarchic faction might have saved the city from the catastrophic defeat to which its democratic ignorance subsequently doomed it. We love oligarchs, got it. Also, they hold the Roman Republic up as the example of what happens when pure democracy is sacrificed for the creation of a republic, but what happened to the Roman Republic? According to National Geographic, Rome transitioned from a republic to an empire after power shifted away from a representative democracy to a centralized imperial authority, with the emperor holding the most power. Huh. Interesting. Sounds exactly like what Heritage Foundation is attempting to do with Project 2025. Concentrate as much power into the hands of one executive. And how did that work for Rome? Well, in case you're not like most men and don't think about the Roman Empire daily, I'll remind you, it fell. The Roman Republic lasted for 500 years, and once it transitioned to an empire under Julius Caesar and his son Augustus, the empire lasted for about 1,000 years. So it worked for a while, but let's not pretend it's infallible. To bring it all home, the report delves into common big R Republican talking points and complaints. The democratic assault on our Constitution's Republican character does not begin its attack politically. It begins much more subtly, gradually replacing our taste of and appreciation for distinctions of any kind, be they within our familial, educational, civic, or religious lives, with a demand more powerful by the day for an equality of outcome. Today, this is reflected in the participation trophies handed out at youth sporting events, where everyone wins a trophy regardless of whether their team won or lost. That is, when the parents and coaches even bother to keep score. After all, acknowledging and thus discriminating between winners, who get the trophies and the accolades that follow from their victory, and losers who do not get such rewards, appears to be an affront to the fundamental equality that defines all individuals under this regime. In order to spare the losers from the unflattering experience of losing, our attachment to equality of conditions makes it impossible for anyone to win. Again, whether this speaks to you depends on your values and worldview. To some, the world is full of winners and losers, and that's just the natural way of things. Forced equality is trying to overwrite the natural way of things. To others, people are generally equal and deserve equality at the expense of some people being winners. Again, if you've historically been a winner or identify yourself as a winner, then you'll likely be in the first camp. Many Americans fall into the first camp because the American dream has brainwashed us into believing that we're all just one good idea away from being millionaires, as opposed to the reality that we're mostly all just one or two bad ideas or crises away from homelessness, or are actually homeless. But that aspirational, traditional view of the American dream, where we're all just temporarily embarrassed millionaires, makes many of us identify as a winner, or aspire to be a winner. So threats to our ability to win are therefore bad. Democracy is, in fact, according to the Heritage Foundation, against everything conservatives hold dear. Not only liberty, but our very way of life. Democratic habits, an ethic of familiarity, and egalitarian social, fiscal, and educational policies have erased any meaningful differences between the sexes, denied the special place reserved under the law for the traditional family, replaced procreation with the equalizing power of choice as the basis of marriage, flattened economic inequalities between the rich and poor, treated good and bad students as equals, and dissolved the difference between citizen and foreigner. As for religion, especially its Judeo-Christian form, democratic mockery of it and its preoccupations with the soul has long pushed this elevating source to the sidelines of American life. Democracy is what we have to blame for equality of the sexes, decimation of the traditional family, choosing to marry instead of just doing it for procreation, and then some other things that aren't even happening, like flattened economic inequalities between the rich and poor. First of all, literally, what? Economic inequalities between the rich and poor have never been greater in this country. And even if they weren't, we're saying that's a bad thing? Again, this entire argument comes down to a fundamental difference between how you see the world. Everyone deserves dignity and equality, or some people are winners and some are losers, and that's just how it is. But then when you take that further and say, okay, why not just allow there to be winners and losers in government as well, majorities and minorities? Then they turn around and argue that majority rule is hurting minorities. Maybe if they just tried harder, they wouldn't be minorities. Do you think of that? It's just the natural order of things. Maybe think about not being a loser. Ever tried that? This is where the report gets somehow even more insidious. He writes, "We fight over the proper meaning of equality and how to achieve it, not its fundamental goodness or desirability. Or over how to register and affect the majority's wishes, not over whether majorities should rule. Not even those with the greatest incentive to criticize the majority, the losers of elections in America, do so. These men and women will blame anyone or anything else, the media, their opponents, the economy, their staffs, even themselves, for their losses before thinking of criticizing the wisdom and goodwill of the American majority." Oh, I see. This is a way to question the legitimacy of elections. Even though the 2020 election was won by Biden through our small r Republican electoral college. But that's why you have to start questioning the legitimacy of the votes themselves, because questioning the legitimacy of democracy isn't enough in this scenario. He further drives home his point when he says, "We're also likely to see a push to increase voter participation in communal decisions by greater use of technology. Various forms of digital democracy, or e-democracy as it is sometimes called, are already used by democratic countries throughout the West for everything from filing taxes to making communal budgetary decisions to voting in national referenda and elections. While critics have pointed out the numerous dangers posed by this use of technology, its democratic defenders have responded that many of these problems can be addressed through increased governmental control over social media and regulation of the internet." Again, a big R Republican talking point veiled in academic-sounding rhetoric. Increased voter participation is bad and should be questioned at every turn, especially because technology. We saw this argument over and over again after the 2020 election, and this paper is just putting an academic veneer on it. The ultimate issue, according to this report from the Heritage Foundation, not enough respect for natural intellectual inequality. He says that in order to resurrect the correct Republican values of robust religious belief and maintenance of the traditional family requires cultivating once again an appreciation for difference and inequality, and chiefly an inequality of intellect that is at the heart of republicanism and anathema to pure or direct democracy. If we fail to cultivate this respect for intellectual superiority, then any efforts to defend Republican forms like the filibuster or the Electoral College, or to promote voluntary associations or defend vibrant religious practice critical to our freedom, will be the political equivalent of whack-a-mole. The solution? It's up to universities to remind students and perpetuate intellectual inequality, primarily by exposing students to literature that is neither modern nor democratic. A kind of aristocratic literature, he calls it. He ends the entire report by saying, pessimism about the prospects of recovering a healthy respect for the intellectual inequality so necessary to Republican freedom might well be justified. But given what is at stake, a republic, if we can keep it, to paraphrase Benjamin Franklin's legendary quip, the fight must go on. Okay, so to summarize, democracy is bad. Democracy means equality. Equality means our liberty will be taken away. It also somehow means an attack on traditional religious and family values. This is also bad, especially for the people who have traditionally held power, like academics, oligarchs, and Christians. A republic means that the minority won't be overrun by majority rule. And the Founding Fathers definitely wanted minorities to be calling the shots. Not the brown minorities, to be clear, just the white people who didn't agree with the other white people. And this messaging has been filtered through the Heritage Foundation to politicians like Mike Lee, and then down into Republican and conservative voters, and then down into the comment section of my videos where now it's my problem. In a 2022 New York Times article, the reporter asked an Arizona Republican voter what this all meant to her. She said, well, to me, what a democracy is like 51% of the people can decide that they want my property and they can take it. Where a constitutional republic is, no, you can't do that. And in part that's true. In a pure Athenian democracy, if 51% of the voters arbitrarily decided to take your land, that was enforced. That's how Socrates was put to death. A bare majority of people said he should drink hemlock, bada bing bada boom, he's a goner. That is not the type of democracy anyone is ever talking about when they say democracy today. No one is arguing for that. And saying that they are is either ignorant or disingenuously mischaracterizing a nuanced and thoughtfully created balance between republicanism and democracy in the US government and in the Constitution, which frankly, if you think about it, is an insult to our founding fathers. That being said, however, I think it is important to talk about the differences and how our government was not designed to be a pure democracy or exclusively democratic in every institution. The Founding Fathers did fear the unwashed masses and mob rule, because there is evidence from history that pure democracies don't work, which is why the framers of the Constitution built in checks and balances and other tools that slow down the legislative process so that it's not just the will of the majority run amok. What this means in practice, at least today in 2023, while we operate under a constitution written 250 years ago, is that, for example, California is roughly 78 times larger than Wyoming, but their senators have equal say in our laws. The smaller states also get a disproportionate say in who becomes president. Each of California's electoral votes represents over 700,000 people. Each of Wyoming's represents 200,000 people. In the past 35 years, the Republican presidential candidate has won the popular vote one time, despite occupying the White House for nearly half that time. Since 2000, Republican senators have never represented a majority of Americans, but controlled the Senate for half that period. During Trump's presidency, a president who didn't win the popular vote and a Senate that didn't represent half of the population put in place 3 Supreme Court justices that now make up an increasingly conservative court. And this was by design, thanks to the compromises that were made with smaller states in the creation of our Constitution that led to the creation of these small R Republican aspects of our government. And now those aspects are pretty exclusively benefiting big R Republicans who now dominate rural and southern communities. Which is why Republicans have renewed the cries that the United States is a republic, not a democracy, because they are no longer a majority and it's the only way for them to maintain control. And by painting it as an issue of their minority status and being victims of mob mentality, they can make it seem like they're the victims in all of this now that white Christians no longer call all the shots. Okay, but I opened this whole video by telling you that the United States is both a democracy and a republic, but mostly it's neither. To recap, the US is a democracy because in 2023, when someone says democracy with no additional qualifiers, they are talking about representative democracy and democratic ideals of equality and open and fair elections. We have both of that in our House of Representatives, in our state legislatures, and in many of our processes for passing referenda at the local level. The US is also a republic because it has a constitution and other checks and balances so that the rule of the bare majority must be at least tempered by the will of minorities. This includes the Supreme Court and the Electoral College. The reason that it's neither in the end is because in both a democracy and a republic, the legitimacy of the government comes from the people. Both are based on the consent of the people to be governed, and both must answer to the will of the people, even if it's not as responsive to the will of the majority in the case of a republic. However, studies have shown that our government is generally incredibly unresponsive to the will of the people, of like any people, except for one group. In 2014, researchers out of Princeton did a study to see how responsive public policy is to the preferences of average Americans. The idea being that if a larger percentage of the general public supports an idea, there should be a greater likelihood that a law or public policy would shift or change based on the preference of the public, especially where an incredibly large portion of the public supports that policy. They then compared that to how responsive public policy is to the preferences of special interest groups and economic elites. They found that when looking at the preferences of the average Americans, whether a public policy or law had 0 support, 50% support, or 100% support made absolutely zero difference. Across the board, the likelihood of the law passing was around 30%, whether only 9% of the population supported it or 90%. The study concluded that when the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. More sinister, however, is the researchers finding that this flat 30% chance of public policy passing only applied to the bottom 90% of the population. Those in the top 10% had much more sway over politicians. So where 85% of elites support a public policy, it has more like a 46% chance of passing. Reminder that for the bottom 90%, there's a 30% chance of public policy passing regardless of how much they support it. And when elites do not support something, when their support is at 0%, the likelihood of that public policy passing also hovers at around 0%, meaning that when they don't want something, the government is incredibly responsive to pressure from elites to shut it down. And so we have a government that is both a democracy and a republic on paper, but in practice is only swayed by the wealthiest 10% of us. This is in part due to negligent interpretation of the First Amendment by the Supreme Court and Citizens United, which equated money to free speech and gave corporations the same free speech protections as citizens. But this is also in part by design. The Constitution was written by white men who owned land, many of whom came from the academy, many of whom had enriched themselves off the backs of enslaved people or were willing to compromise with those who did. It was written to intentionally exclude enslaved people, women, and poor people. Not because they just didn't know better. Women were asking to be included, enslaved people were trying to be free. They were concerned with creating a republic where the voice of minorities were only protected so far as they had a seat at the table to begin with. And you only got a seat at that table by being wealthy, male, and white. And we have had to amend our Constitution numerous times to get to a place where all adult citizens have the right to participate in government, to extend the democratic elements of our Constitution to everyone. Of course, not including many formerly incarcerated people. And even after we amended it to extend the vote to more groups of people, we still had to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to enforce those rights from erosion from things like poll taxes. And even still, those rights are being eroded through passage of voter ID laws, voter intimidation, gerrymandering, and now straight-up election denial. So of course it behooves Republicans to denounce democracy and claim we're only a republic, because it gives them free rein to break down the democratic principles that are supposed to be enshrined in our Constitution and its amendments. But those of you in my comment section screaming that it's a republic and not a democracy, this applies to you too. It's neither. They've convinced you to believe this lie because it gives them an easy soundbite and support at the polls, but they know in the end it's not you or your vote that matters. It's making sure that the death grip that the top 1% has on our country never goes away. Because when it does, our democratic republic might actually start listening to the will of the 90%. The problem in all of this, like I discussed in my last video, is that we treat our Constitution and the Founding Fathers as God-given and infallible in a way no other Western democracy does. By doing so, we put the fate of our nation in 2023 in the hands of a group of landed white Christian men from over 250 years ago who very much did not want most of us to participate in government at all, whether it's a democracy or a republic. And what's the solution? Say with me, getting taking money out of politics. Thank you. Updating the Constitution with an amendment that would further the ideals of both a democracy and a republic, that the government is by and for the people. I've said this so many times, but check out movetoamend.org and sign their petition. Click on their Learn More tab and educate yourself. Go to opensecrets.org and look up your congresspeople to see where they've taken money from, and then call them to tell them that we need to get money out of politics, and if they don't do something about this, we'll organize and find someone to run against them who will. And share this video with your friends. And if you like this video, you'll also like my video on the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. And hey, if you didn't know, my work in bringing you these videos week after week, which collectively take about 25 to 30 hours each to make, is supported in part through my Patreon, where I do weekly chats on our private Discord server, book giveaways, early access to videos, access to my research notes, and monthly Ask Me Anything style live streams just for Patreon supporters. If you like what you've been watching and any of that sounds good, I encourage you to check me out over on Patreon today. Thank you to my Patreon supporters, including my newest patrons, and an extra special shout out to my multi-platinum patrons Thomas Johnson, Sophia Sams, Anthony Giles, and Brett Piantek. And thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye!